Everybody. Welcome to the Culture Clinic, our first episode. I'm Skate DL, the co-founder here at Gusto, joined by HR professional Kwesi Thomas. Kwesi, you want to do a quick intro on yourself and your background?
Sure, great. Thanks, Gabe. My name is Kwesi Thomas. I've been in HR for probably about 23, 24 years now, all the way from Nortel, BlackBerry, a bit of Manulife, Shopify, and then been on my own doing consulting for about 6 years now. And guiding to help companies that are growing and going through sort of the pains of going from smaller companies to larger companies and helping them grow. And so it's been an interesting ride.
Yeah, and you're very humble. I mean, in our conversations, learning about everything that you've been involved in building, not just recognition programs, but total rewards programs. Companies like BlackBerry when they were scaling up, and then kind of later Shopify. So huge success stories there, and then I'm sure you played kind of an integral role in getting those people operations teams kind of properly set up.
Yeah, I mean they were definitely some good rides as we're going up, and I've been part of some trends that were going the other way as well, and learned a lot in those as well. So I think for me, discovered that I really like helping companies grow. I like that sort of like small and going from nothing to something, or from something to something larger. And so a lot of those companies have been doing that when I joined them, and I've experienced, like I said, sort of shrinking as well, and that has its learnings and some positive things as well. But I've gotten to do a lot of cool programs in some companies that were doing some cool things in Canada and across the world. Right.
Cool. All right. Well, let's dive in. The idea here is that you've seen a lot of things, right, in kind of your career, and there's an audience out there that might be kind of partway through or just starting kind of their HR career. And so, like, how do we give them access to your knowledge? And so the idea here being that anybody can ask questions, and we're going to kind of bring those on and kind of surface those for you and get your thoughts and your takes, and the conversation might go in a bunch of different directions. But I've really enjoyed our conversations over the last couple of years, and that was kind of the what just sparked the idea for this, right? Like, how do we just have these conversations publicly? Like, how do we, I'm often asking you questions and learning a lot. So that'd be great to kind of share with our audience. So, to start, we pulled some of our customers and got some questions to kind of get us going here. And we'll keep an eye on kind of the chat. If any kind of audience members want to drop some questions for Kwesi, we'll tackle those as well. But a lot of questions as companies are going back to the office and kind of finding themselves in these hybrid working situations. Some people in the office, some people working remotely, or maybe people working both at home and in the office on different days and whatnot. How do we guard against proximity bias? And like, what is proximity bias? Maybe we should just start there.
What it is? It is the bias that sort of happens where you give preferential treatment to the people who are closer to you, who are in your proximity, right? Exactly as it sounds. So it's interesting. This is something I think I've lived for a long time in my career. We'll talk about that throughout. But I think it's an interesting topic, because as people change how they work, how we distribute, recognize, reward, promote everything in the work, it'll change as well, because some of those things that were just in the hallway at a desk in a meeting will change, right? So proximity bias is that bias that happens when you recognize, or not recognize is the wrong word, but when we're preferential to people who are in your proximity.
And so, well, let's double click on kind of some of your experiences then, before we kind of like dive into kind of solutions here. Like, what are some of those lived experiences that you've gone through? Because here at Gusto, we were an all in office company, and then when COVID hit, went fully remote. And so there's still some element of kind of proximity bias in that, I'm based here in Vancouver, and we'll see occasionally some team members here in Vancouver, and now we've obviously hired kind of across the country, but definitely for organizations that are working in hybrid situations, and I think a lot of your career you've been kind of in and out of these, so maybe share some of those stories. Let's start there and kind of like understand what you've been through and what's kind of guided your thinking on this.
Right, that's a great place to start. When I started at BlackBerry, it was probably about an hour drive, good weather, from where I was living, and so I was working probably about 2 days a week from home. And in the winter, if we had bad weather, 3 or 4 days, and maybe it's 4 days a week that week, right? So it really depended. It really was more of a response to where I was physically compared to the office, and so I had to start adjusting. So at that time, we probably didn't have a name for it. We didn't have any, we didn't have a lot of people doing it, but I had to work through what that was like to be not in the office 2 days a week. And at that point, managing a team of employees who were in the office more often, or working with other people who were in the office 5 days a week. And then as a global company, there were teams and team members I was working with or managing who weren't in the same office, right? And so we had to work. I was managing a team that had employees who may have been in Singapore, or who may have been in London, or in Slough. Sorry, not in London. Where I was working with people who were virtual. So that was quite a long time ago. During my time at Shopify, I was based in Toronto, similar to about an hour and a 20-minute drive from the office. But most of my team and colleagues were actually in Ottawa. So I was working pretty virtually with that team as well, and going out there fairly often. But there are a lot of tips and tricks and things that we tried. At one point, I'll give you a small example. At one point, the office here in Toronto, we just put on what was Hangouts at the time. It's called a little different now, but we put on Hangouts just for the day, 1 day a week. We just turned it on in the morning and stayed on all day long in the room where we were, and the other team in the other office did the same thing. So you could just literally walk up to the screen and ask a question, like, "Hey," right?
Knock.
Yeah, it was a very interesting experiment. But that, and then after sort of Shopify, once I started working, and I'm called consulting, but my consulting is I try to get a couple companies and work very deeply with them. It's not like I'm shooting with a lot of companies. And so in doing that, I started working with a company in Singapore that became from 1 day a week became 4 days a week, and they were based in Toronto, and they were based in Singapore, and I was based in Toronto. And I was managing a team that was both here and there for them. So quite a bit of that I'm trying to manage through that bias before sort of COVID hit, and that changed everyone's world. But having to work through it has been sort of my life for some time now.
And so what were the common things that you like that cause proximity bias, and like what are some strategies that we could kind of give to audience members here on like how to just be aware of them, and how to build kind of some policies or procedures in to think about guarding against proximity bias?
Yeah, I think one of the big ones that people talk, it kind of bubbles up to the top immediately, is the bias that happens, especially from the leadership or the management, that you're working from home, so you're not doing anything, or you're doing less, or you're off golfing when you should be on working, right? And then all these perceptions that as COVID helps people know, it's probably not true, or sometimes it is for some people, but that's a different problem for another day. But I think a lot of that has to do with communication, and I will say that over and over. Understanding what's happening, what people are working on, when they're working on it, what they're delivering, when they're communicating. A lot of proximity bias happens because communication sometimes is a lot easier in person or quicker in person. Right? It doesn't require as much effort. And for a lot of what I experienced at that time, I'd say a lot of the onus was on me to make sure I was communicating more. And I was communicating so that people weren't wondering what I was doing, or what I would be on, or what I'd be in the office. And that communication, I think now that burden is now shared a bit more with the leadership and the employees, so that they're both communicating, so that they're clearing that path, right? So that you can share work, share accomplishments, share feedback, share results. And so that's removing some of the bias. And to be frank, there are a lot of tools and mediums that have come out and are able to help you do that. I think they're all, some of them are really good, but I think really no matter which the tool, there's a conscious effort that has to be made by both the person, the leader, and the team who may be having the bias, and the person who is working remotely. Both have to make a conscious effort to to work through that and to make sure that they are addressing it, and it's not just something that just happens. That's one. So that's one is conscious communication and being aware of the communication. The other one are just, there are, I've seen some things about, some articles even preparing for this. They talk about sort of video calls and making sure that, if some people aren't in the office, maybe making sure that everybody's on a video call, that type of thing. I have my own, my leaning is, I think things should be fair. They don't necessarily have to be equal. They have to be fair.
Yeah.
So, I was at a client's probably about a month ago, and, when I was there, I went physically there. I flew out. I hadn't done that for almost 2 years. That was new, but I went back to their office. And when I was there, everyone sort of who was in person came into the room. There was that socializing. How was your weekend? Yada, yada, yada. And when they were ready to start, the kind of who was chairing the meeting kind of opened the video conference, and then those people joined and they went on to business. And I thought to myself while I was there, we should have opened that video when we walked in the room, right? There's no reason that the people remotely could not have been in that discussion, right? And similarly, a lot of the tools have ways to like raise hands and things like that, but you have to be conscious of making sure we bring those people into the conversation, bring them into what's happening, and they aren't at a disadvantage because 3 people are talking in the same room. And that'll be my third one. I'll segue to the third one. You can just I'm just use the word conscious a lot because this is where I think this is a lot of when I hear bias. I think the way to address it, the best way is to raise the awareness of it. And then if you raise the awareness of it, you can then address it and be more conscious of how you react and work and conversate and do everything else. And so the other one is being aware of how you're distributing work, how you are receiving that, how we are in the meeting having a conversation, so that those people who aren't in the room can have input, right, and can have a say, and aren't just the recipients on the back of the train. They're in the driver's seat as well sometimes. One of the ones I read, which I thought was fantastic, was make sure the materials for the meeting are prepared for a virtual environment. So you're not coming to the meeting with work that like with material that is like, oh yeah, you're on video or you're in a conference, so you won't be able to see this or share this. You got to make sure that everything you came to the meeting with to share was ready for that medium. I hope I've answered the question. There are a lot of things. I think for me, the big two communications, and both people being responsible for that communication, and be raising the sort of consciousness or awareness that you are going to make an effort to understand that there's bias there and how you address it. Yeah.
Awesome. And, I think a lot of the people kind of watching this might be kind of in the HR seat, thinking about like, okay, this is great. This is great advice for my managers, and I can have those conversations and whatnot. But like, how can we build process? How can I build something that's like standardized to, do our best as a company to like remove this bias? And I love your last suggestion there around like, hey team, every meeting has to be prepared in a format that is applicable to remote first. And that way, kind of people in the office aren't getting preferential treatment. Do you have any other kind of like tips for the HR team trying to build process beyond kind of just, some conversations with their managers?
It's funny. I'm going to try to answer this. My nature is always to think of what I'm not going to do first, and then I'll figure out what I'm going to do second. So it's easier for me to answer some of the things I've seen that I'm probably my gut reactions to some things. One of the tenets for me is not to have, is to set out some principles before I get into those things. For me, big one would be, I don't want to punish the people who are remote, but I also want to punish the people who are in person as well. And so whatever processes we're going to build are going to be fair. And I'm going to use that all the time. I think you've probably heard that from me a million times over the past couple of years, fair and equal. Fair isn't equal, but we'll try to be fair. And I think for me, the big ones is I build the processes to be fair, recognize that they are remote, but understand that there are some limitations of being remote. So in building the programs, I want to make sure they're actually sustainable. Right? They're reasonable and they're sustainable, meaning I haven't built this program in a way that has created so much work or so much work, additional work that people won't actually do it. Right. Yeah. And so even my suggestion about, having materials prepared for everyone to share, that is creating work. I want to make sure that is reasonably, there's a reasonable way to do that. I do think that having a forum by which questions or parking lots or things that would have been written on a whiteboard in a meeting or written down in notes, etc., there's a forum where that can be shared and tracked together through the meeting. And that could be, I've seen a couple successful ways of doing that with some companies where there might be a Google Doc that is live that people have the ability to see while they're, it may not be shared on the screen, but it's a live doc. You can log in and see some of the notes or some of the parking lot issues or things that are being written down. I think that's fantastic. As a program, I'm trying to think what else I would do as a program. I want to make a big one. I want to make sure results are somewhere that they're measurable, that people can understand what we're actually achieving and who's supposed to do what. It's very easy to leave the meeting sometimes and not know who's doing what or not know in the program who's supposed to what. I think however you're building your tool, your programs for people to work with, there is a way for people to understand what's expected after this is done.
I love that, kind of being very upfront about kind of results and being results oriented. And I think we had a similar question come in from a client just around like the challenge around kind of having more introverted employees, and if they're in kind of a remote environment and like how that just like compounds like their work being kind of undervalued, right? If they're not always kind of like speaking up in meetings and whatnot, whereas if they were in person, there might be a little bit more visibility and opportunity for them to kind of participate. So I love that idea of kind of like being very clear about like what are the results that we're driving, and like if we're measuring against these results, it doesn't matter whether people are kind of in the office or not. But maybe you can kind of expand. Have you seen in your kind of experience, kind of working with individuals that might be a little bit more introverted, and how HR teams might make sure to kind of surface their work?
Yeah, interestingly enough, I think there are some real advantages for some of for people who are more introverted in this new environment of being remote, because you don't need to jump up in front of everyone and have an opinion in a meeting. You can drop a comment into the section of the video call. You can send an email off afterwards. You can there are tools and ways to communicate that shall be more frequent, not more acceptable, but more frequently used because of the nature of being remote and having more people be remote. So definitely making sure that if there are polls, questions, emails, conversations that are happening, those that you are looking to make sure that those populations who might be introverted or whatever else, that they are sharing those opinions more often. I think, I can think of an example. I'm trying not to use client names, but in the leadership team, there's one of the leaders who has a harder time with English. Brilliant person. And it could be easily forgotten that, he may not jump in as quickly on some of the topics. And sometimes I think, we might be going really fast and he might need to slow down for a second. And I think, regardless of it, in person, it might be easier to remember that, but in virtually, I think we have to be more conscious of going, hey, let's pause and make sure that person had the time to ask a question, raise their hand, etc. So I do think there is the possibility of those being left out more, but I think I do think there are more programmatic ways. Just me personally, I just think there are more ways to actually address this in a virtual world than there are when you're in person, right? I think you can make sure that you can poll, you can notice that person hasn't sent an email, hasn't sent to Slack, hasn't done anything like that, and ask for that opinion.
Interesting. Just a note here to kind of the audience, because I've seen a number of people kind of joining. If you do have questions for Kwesi, whether you or me, you're the pro though. Whether around proximity bias, we've got a number of questions here that we've kind of grouped together from clients around proximity bias. But anything, this is really kind of an ask me anything format. We'd love to kind of give our audience access to the HR experts that we've been working with here, and Kwesi's one of them. So feel free to kind of drop those in. We'll do our best to kind of get to all the questions. How do you deal with jobs, and you've probably seen this, that are actually done like better on site than remotely,
right?
And you kind of like tackle that with proximity bias?
There's definitely no one size fits all on this question. Like there isn't a one size fits all. But you have to look for ways to still get some of the results you need. I'll use an example. There's a team that has their whole premise. If you're in SaaS, you kind of know the premise of SDRs and calls coming in, and then you're bubbling up to the AEs, and off you go. Can be done very well virtually. It can, but if you've got a complex product, those SDRs develop by asking those AEs questions live sometimes and bouncing things off, and and so that job I've seen it done virtually. It can be done well, but I've also seen it done in person. And my personal view is that the speed of the growth of the team is faster in person because they get to sharpen each other on a more frequent basis. So how do you deal with that? And I know there are lots of teams that do this virtually that are doing a great job, and they're not saying that you can't be done that way. But how do you deal with it? And some of it is using tools and technology, of course. Some of it, if you can be in person, then maybe it's not in person every day. Maybe there is, for one client, my suggestion to them was, whether it's 2 days, 3 days, whatever it is, and make those days that are typically, when I say typically, in office for a majority of the team. So there is those days where things are being done and and you're getting those results that you want from that team being in the same place. Doesn't mean it has to be forced. There are a lot. I mean, that can go way deeper on that, but assuming I met that at the super high level, and you can figure out whether that makes sense for which days. And I know people are poking holes in their head, like, but what if they can't come that day? And like, I'm saying the broad strokes. That's what I mean. Of course, you start working through the actual details of it, but I think the truth is sometimes you have to find ways to put people together. Sometimes, right? And how you do that for the team is going to be different. And I'll be very frank, as the technology catches up, and technology is doing a wild job right now trying to catch up with what COVID COVID took the next 20 years of organizational changes and made it happen in 2 years, right? So as the technology catches up to that, more of this will become less of an issue. But as of now, there are some things that, where you might want to be in person on the same days. There's an insurance company I used to work with, and they didn't do this because of remote work. They did it because of space. They just got a smaller space. And so, people weren't coming in as often, but what they did was they had there was days that HR was in the office. They were there together on Tuesday and Thursday. Marketing was there on Monday and Wednesday. Sales was there and they just programmed it that way. So that the days that were in the office, and sometimes people still weren't there, those were productive. They were meant to be very productive because you had the co-working you needed on those days.
Right. And imagine a scenario though where there are employees that, like here at Gusto, right? Like I would love to do kind of like Tuesdays in the office, but we've hired people all across Canada now, so it's just not even an option. We could kind of do Tuesdays in the office, and everybody like in their cities go to co-working spaces and whatnot. And we've actually started exploring co-working budgets for that reason, just to get people kind of connecting. But to get the marketing team together or the sales team kind of together is just not going to be possible on a regular basis. So imagine a scenario where you do have kind of like the majority of the sales team kind of like getting together, but there are kind of like one or two people that just can't be involved in that. Like how do we build in or think about protecting against kind of proximity bias for those individuals?
Yeah, now you're into this is going to be very culturally, and I mean cultural as in company culture, dependent on how you address some of this stuff, right? But for that example you just gave, a lot of the things that you're going to do that are going to be regular cadences. So your one-on-ones, you're going to make sure you're going to have one-on-ones with those people regularly. You're going to make sure that you're having meetings where they're included in meetings. If a topic comes up and you're like, hey, it just came up because we're in person and we're going to just work through this in person, you can't do that. You have to stop yourself and bring the person into that meeting. I'll actually say Shopify was really good at that when I was there. Hangouts was almost like we didn't have phones. It was your Hangouts, but people were pretty good at going, hey, you got 2 minutes to hop on this Hangout, and you had your headphones everywhere you went. And no matter what, you just pop in your headphones and join the conversation, right? And so you've got to find ways to make to be very, again, conscious that you're having the right people in the right room in the right conversation, and the room being virtual. to combat against that, right? It's funny. This might be very controversial to say. I still think there's just absolute value in having people meet each other at some point, right?
Yep.
When I worked with, I had teams in Singapore. After going and spending a week with them and coming back, the way we worked, understood each other was very different, and I think probably more productive than the year before when I hadn't met them at all, right? I still think companies are doing lots of ways to figure this out. I know it's not in everyone's budget to fly everyone in and do like all hands together annually or sales kickoffs all hand. There's lots of ways to do it, but it might be not the cool thing to say, but there's some value in having people just meet at some point.
Fully agree. And shout out to our HR team, who is currently kind of organizing our all hands or all team kind of offsite happening in the spring. And it's no small feat kind of getting, we're going to be 55, maybe 60 people by then. So, but worth it, right? And worth kind of getting people to kind of connect and they can go back to kind of working remotely and have kind of a better working relationship. But just double clicking kind of again on like this scenario and thinking about like tactics that we can kind of, give to our audience here of HR leaders. When we think specifically about kind of recognition, rewards, promotions, things like that, do HR teams have ways of kind of like mitigating kind of proximity bias and working with managers and like maybe setting up committees to kind of review promotions, things like that? Like what are your recommendations there?
Yeah, so there are some things that are probably just good, healthy HR practices. I mean, promotions and some of those things that are going to be, advancing people. I always will recommend that is not done in a silo. That should involve more than just the manager and just the HR person's opinion. There should be the people who they're working with at the leadership level, other people's opinions involved in that as well, to remove some of that bias. That's going to happen for proximity in a whole bunch of different ways. They can just be closer as people. They just drive to work together every day because they come on the same route, right? There are lots of other reasons to remove that bias by having other people in promotions or in raises, in progressions, and we should do that. That should be there, and should have been there before COVID, right? And should continue to be there after, post COVID. In looking at how we distribute work, I think everybody's always striving to have more metrics and more measurable things that they can like look at numbers and measure people by. The more you can do that, the better. The easier it is to remove some of these biases because the output that you're getting from your team. And in some ways, that's a lot more work for some people. That is now actually keeping notes on one-on-ones, keeping notes on the work that we're asking people to do, and the results that they're yielding. So the more you can programmatically, not just look at performance annually and look at it more often and have a better gauge on how people are performing, the more you can remove that bias of using, qualitative measures that might just be biased, and having some quantitative measures as well. And quantitative does not mean it has to be metrics. It could just be my notes over the past 6 months and, some things that we've recorded over the past 6 months that may not just been a number, but they were things that we can look back and say, look, I've given this person these 8 projects, or I've given this person no projects, and that's a bad thing, right? Like just you can look at the work that they were doing. So I think as a tool, I think we have to get much more specific and much more conscious, programmatic about how we measure performance and how we record and keep track of what we're asking people to do and how they're performing doing it. And the more we do that, the less these biases will have an effect on promotions, raises, etc.
And it's something that I've found, just using our recognition tool internally, which, kind of a story for another time, but at a point in time, we didn't even use it internally. But being able to kind of like look back over a period of time and see not just the recognition that I've maybe given to certain direct reports or other people in the organization, but the amount of recognition that people have received and also given kind of a peer-to-peer level, right? And justifying kind of promotions and whatnot. Well, not justifying, but factoring that into the equation. The other thing that I'd love your input on that I've been hearing some other companies doing, I think we could start doing here internally, is skip level one-on-ones.
Yeah.
So maybe talk to me a little bit about how to do that properly, and how that might help to kind of remove some bias.
Yeah, I mean, those are, if they're not happening, they're very healthy. They'll probably happen less often, right? But removing the barrier of of having to speak to only the person who directly report to you takes a level of both management, company culture, maturity that's really healthy, right? I believe for myself, a lot of the managers that I thought had the most impact, that I was probably did my best work for my career, were not in my way in terms of working with people above them, or working with people. And I say above, I don't like that word, but people in leaderships, whether it's their direct boss or other people in other organizations. And I think, if you can build in that, not just as a skip level programmatically, but as a culture, right? That the team is able to have those conversations, and also leaders are able to have conversations, skip level down. It's healthy, both for understanding performance, helping with engagement. It helps a ton. But but programmatically, if you should be on a fairly frequent basis, as much as the business will allow, having skip level conversations, and we can say, oh, it's just your manager, but it could be anybody in the organization. I think having the leaders or peer leaders who you're working across with, it helps. For example, if you're in HR, there probably is a comp leader, a benefits leader, a talent and acquisition leader. There are other leaders. Skip levels, a lot of times people go immediately to like, okay, but it's the one above. We should be able to work across with those other leaders, because those other leaders will be sitting around the table during those calibrations or reviews or performances or raises as well, and have an opinion. And so you want that to not just be one up, but also broad.
And what sort of cadence would you recommend? Like, thinking just about myself, I've got kind of 7 direct reports. Each of them, has a number of kind of direct reports. Would it be enough for me to kind of be doing like once a week, like meeting with one skip level person? And so I've got about 49 people, kind of like.
That's one a year for each person. I mean, I don't know if you'll find time for one a week, but 49 means one a year. You've got 3 weeks off, right? It's a lot, but one a week for a year. I would, if you can do them as often as like once a week, doing one of them, that'd be fantastic.
Okay.
If you can do, a couple of them once a month or once a quarter, that's probably more realistic for what your calendar is going to allow you to do. But I would say at least quarterly, you should be understanding what's happening, if not more often, right? Okay. Also, I mean, the topics for a second, it's not proximity bias, but if you're not doing that, how are you understanding how your leaders are leading?
Yeah.
Like for you, if you're not doing conversations with people, in your customer success team that aren't the customer success leader, you have no idea how that team's actually working, and you don't know how that leader is performing as well. And you're measuring that person's performance and rewarding them, recognizing them, giving the feedback. So you need that feedback as well to do your job well.
Right. And organically, it's happening here at Gusto. We're 55 people, yeah. and so having conversations with people throughout the organization, right? Like we don't have any of this.
It's a challenge that you're going to at some point run into, because at some point it won't be 55, and at this point you're probably still logging into like customer success tickets and looking at things and helping unblock a customer issue at your size. As that grows, you can't log in and hop in and jump on a call, jump on a ticket with one of the success agents. That's going to become harder and harder to do. So, but you're right. Being more, if you can build it into what your regular cadence now, it's easier to keep it rather than try to start it when you're 200.
Awesome. I'll look to do that. Okay, so last question here, kind of before we wrap up. Like, are there any potential bias in the remote kind of work world that we aren't aware of, or that are kind of less discussed?
Less discussed. Interesting. I'm trying to think. I did a lot of reading before we hopped on this call, hopped on today. So I'm trying to think if there's any areas that I thought were we're in highlight. For me, I think the important. I'll say my 2 cents. I said it earlier. I think it's the onus for this is on both the company and the employee. I feel like what it's out there really does put a lot of the onus on the company to find the tools and the processes and the HR leader and the da 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 da. And for me, I come back to at the end of the day, the person who's working from home has to hold some of this responsibility of making sure that they are communicating and working effectively as well as the company giving them the ability and the tools to do so. And I think for me, we have to, what's not discussed is what are we asking our employees to do in this situation? What we know we're asking our leaders to do 1, 2, 3, 4, like we've talked about for most of this meeting. What are we asking our employees to do? Right. And I think there's probably isn't enough material on that. But that's a deeper conversation. I think I also probably have a bias where I also think that the employees and the leaders own how they work and how they get their results more than the HR team does. That's my own. I hope there's a bunch of HR leaders who are going yay right now when I say that, but it's always like the HR team's got to figure this out. But the HR team does not sell, does not market, does not make widgets, and so we can do all our best. But the two people who are going to market and sell and make widgets have to still figure out how to do this in a real way, no matter how many tools and processes and procedures we stick down their throats, right? And so that's probably where I say I'd love to see more literature on what we expect the employees to do and how we expect them to work in this situation, and more of what we expecting the management team and how we get that feedback from them. Those are my 2 things.
Awesome. Cool. Well, this has been a great conversation, Kwesi. Appreciate you kind of taking the time here, and I don't see any other kind of questions or comments. So look forward to seeing everybody back here. We're going to do this every Tuesday, 11 a.m. Pacific or 2 p.m. Eastern. It'll be myself and Kwesi, as well as my co-founder, Joe, and our other HR expert, Shelly, kind of trading in and out. And we're just going to pick your brains for all sorts of different topics, and looking forward to kind of seeing where this thing goes.
All right. This was a lot of fun for me as well. I like talking. I like the concepts of HR. So this was a lot of fun, and thanks for taking the time to talk to me, Skye.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks everybody. Have a great day. Mucho gusto.
All right. Have a good day, everyone.